Clarissa Drake walked through the airport like she owned it, because in her mind she did. Every polished tile under her heels echoed with purpose, and every flick of her neatly styled bun was deliberate. Her uniform was immaculate, her badge gleamed, and her stride held the confidence of someone who had spent years proving herself in an industry where reputation meant everything. She didn't just work flights, she commanded them. Passengers knew her name before she introduced herself, and flight crews followed her lead without question. Clarissa had carved out her kingdom in the skies, and first class was her throne. It wasn't arrogance in her eyes, it was excellence. She had climbed every rung, fought through long nights in impossible passengers, and had emerged on top. She didn't have time for errors, emotions, or excuses. Order, precision, control, that's what mattered. And anything that threatened the pristine image she maintained wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. To Clarissa, first class wasn't a section of the plane. It was a sanctuary, a space where calm reigned, wine was poured with elegance, and the scent of entitlement was masked with jasmine-scented towels. She viewed the first-class cabin not as a service space, but as a performance stage, and she was the star. Every tray placement, every napkin fold, every forced smile was part of the show. And woe to the passenger who forgot their role. Clarissa had seen them all, those who complained about the legroom, who didn't understand wine pairings, or worst of all, those who didn't fit. She never said it outright. That wasn't her style. But in the slight arch of her brow or the forced sweetness in her voice, her judgment was always clear. In her mind, certain people belonged in first class and certain people didn't. She didn't base it on money. After all, anyone could buy a ticket. No, for Clarissa, it was about presentation, composure, quiet affluence. She could spot it a mile away, and she was quick to assess who passed her unspoken test. Flight crews admired her. At least they said they did. She ran a tight ship, never missed a protocol, and was the one you wanted leading when turbulence, literal or otherwise, hit. She trained new recruits with precision, not patience. We don't guess, we don't hesitate, and we do not tolerate disorder, she would say, her voice clipped like her heels on the runway. It wasn't cruelty, it was excellence. That's what she told herself. That's how she slept at night. Because deep down, Clarissa didn't just need control, she feared what would happen if she lost it. Her whole identity was tied to being the one in charge, the one who always knew what to do, the one who was never wrong. She had worked so hard to become untouchable that the very idea of being questioned, challenged, or worse, embarrassed, was unthinkable. And so she became sharp, efficient, feared. Passengers knew not to argue. Those who did often found their drinks forgotten, their requests delayed, their complaints noted. Colleagues who disagreed with her found themselves subtly iced out, their shifts rearranged, their voices diminished. Clarissa had perfected the art of quiet retaliation, nothing you could report, everything you could feel. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of the system, polished, impenetrable, and full of invisible walls. What made Clarissa dangerous wasn't that she broke rules, it's that she enforced them with an iron grip and expected others to do the same, but only as she saw fit. She prided herself on keeping order at all costs, and if she had to bend someone to fit into that order, so be it. She had become so accustomed to being right that she stopped noticing when she was wrong. Her authority wasn't something she questioned, it was something she wore like a second skin. And in her mind, it was earned. She had sacrificed relationships, missed holidays, worked overnight hauls across oceans, and stayed behind when others collapsed under the pressure. She had outlasted the burnouts, the soft-spoken, the too kind to make it. So when she entered that plane, her plane, Clarissa believed she had earned the right to judge, to control, to decide. She didn't know it yet, but that very belief would become her downfall. Because somewhere between upholding rules and controlling outcomes, Clarissa had lost something vital: empathy. She had traded understanding for judgment, compassion for performance, and fairness for favoritism. And like all rulers who forget their people, she had surrounded herself with silence. No one dared correct her. No one challenged her decisions. They let her believe the illusion that she was always right, that her gut was gospel, that her word was final. But even the most polished mask eventually cracks, and hers would crack in the most public, humiliating way. Not with a major mistake, not with a screaming passenger, but with one small decision, one wrong assumption, one moment of misused power that collided with someone she never should have underestimated. One act that took less than a minute, but unraveled years of built-up control. She wouldn't see it coming, because Clarissa Drake had spent too long believing she was untouchable. And when the fall came, it would come hard. Stay tuned, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, control, and the quiet ways people fight back. If you're ready for the moment where everything starts to change, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for part 2. The fall begins with a single step, and hers is just around the corner. It was supposed to be a routine boarding, orderly, uneventful, another first-class flight where Clarissa Drake reigned with unshakable poise. She had checked the manifest, mentally pictured the cabin, and expected a typical crowd of polished suits, expensive watches, and the kind of silence that money buys. That's why, when she looked up and saw the young woman approaching the aircraft door with a baby strapped across her chest, a diaper bag over one shoulder, and the kind of exhaustion in her eyes that only new mothers knew, Clarissa's breath caught, but not with concern, with offense. Olivia Carter didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, not because of her clothes, which were simple but clean, not because of her demeanor, which was polite, even warm. No, it was something else. Something Clarissa could never name but always felt in her gut, an invisible test that some passengers just didn't pass. Maybe it was the baby. Maybe it was the fact that Olivia didn't flinch under her scrutiny. Maybe it was that Clarissa had already decided this woman was a problem before she even opened her mouth. And in that single moment, without knowing her name, her story, or her right to be there, Clarissa marked her as a target. Clarissa didn't smile. She didn't greet her the way she had the businessman before her. Instead, her tone came sharp, cold, like the edge of a blade wrapped in protocol. "First-class passengers only, ma'am," she said, already holding out a hand for the ticket, as if to catch the lie she expected. Olivia blinked, caught off guard, but recovered quickly. "Yes," she replied calmly, though her voice carried the unmistakable fatigue of someone who had already anticipated judgment. "That's me." She handed Clarissa the ticket, and for a fleeting moment, something in her eyes said, "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Clarissa's eyes scanned the stub. The name matched, the seat number was right, the barcode verified, everything was in order. But her mind refused to believe it. She hesitated, her face neutral, but her thoughts racing, trying to find an angle, any angle that would justify sending this woman further back, out of her pristine cabin. Instead, she gave a tight nod and gestured stiffly toward the first-class section. "Very well." Olivia stepped past her, gently rocking her baby, whose soft coos whispered in the air like a warning. The other passengers looked up, not in kindness, but with skepticism. A baby? In first class? Some furrowed their brows, others shifted uncomfortably, but none of them said a word. Not yet. Clarissa, on the other hand, simmered. The sound was barely audible, but in her mind it threatened everything. Her kingdom was built on control and silence, and now that silence was being breached by lullabies and tiny, unpredictable movements. She paced the aisle like a storm cloud, glancing back at Olivia as she settled into her seat, adjusting her blanket, humming softly to her child. Clarissa didn't see a mother doing her best. She saw a disruption waiting to happen. And when control was her oxygen, even the idea of losing it was enough to choke her. It didn't take long. The baby made a sound, not a scream, not a cry, just a small, sleepy whimper. And that was all Clarissa needed. She pounced. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she descended on Olivia's row, her voice lowered but sharp as steel. "Ma'am, I'll need you to keep your child quiet. Our first-class passengers expect a certain level of peace during the flight." Olivia's face flushed. She sat straighter, gently rocking her baby. "I'm doing my best. He's just settling in, but I'll keep him calm." Her voice was apologetic but firm, the kind of tone that said, "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I won't be pushed around either." That tone only infuriated Clarissa more. She didn't hear a screaming infant. She heard defiance, so she added pressure. If the noise continues, she said coolly, we may need to move you to a different section of the plane. And just like that, the mask slipped. Olivia's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Clarissa saw something she wasn't used to seeing in a passenger. Disbelief, anger, dignity. I have a first-class ticket, Olivia said slowly, as if trying to remind the universe and the flight attendant in front of her of something that shouldn't even be in question. I'm not moving. The quiet around them thickened. A businessman in the next row shifted. A woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow. No one spoke, but everyone listened. Everyone saw. Clarissa, still wearing her armor of authority, stood her ground, unblinking. If your child becomes a disruption, I have every right to act in the interest of other passengers. And in that moment, Olivia did something that would change everything. She didn't argue, she didn't beg. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and sent a single text. That's it, one message. And Clarissa didn't know it yet, but that message would be the match to light the fire under everything she thought she had under control. Because Olivia Carter wasn't just any mother, and she wasn't just holding a baby. She was holding something far more powerful than Clarissa's rulebook. She was holding truth, and soon the world would see it. So if you're still here, listening, stay with me. Because this is the moment the story begins to unravel. This is the moment power starts to shift. You've seen Clarissa in her element, but now you're about to see what happens when the illusion of control collides with quiet resistance. Don't blink. The fall is coming, and it's nothing short of unforgettable. If this part of the story made you feel something, drop a comment to show Olivia some love. Like this video if you're rooting for her, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next? You won't want to miss it. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to suffocate. Clarissa Drake paced like a lioness in too small a cage, eyes flicking toward 2A, Olivia Carter's seat, every few seconds. Each coo, each innocent shift from the baby nestled against Olivia's chest was treated like an offense. Clarissa couldn't stand the softness, the quiet resilience, the lack of apology in the woman's gaze. She had expected compliance, fear, regret, but what she saw was calm. It infuriated her. It wasn't just the baby anymore. It was the audacity Olivia had to exist in Clarissa's first class without shrinking, and that audacity needed to be crushed. What Clarissa didn't realize was that her escalating fury wasn't about noise or policy. It was about control, hers slipping through her fingers in front of a plane full of silent witnesses who were beginning to see her for what she truly was. A woman so addicted to power she'd destroy someone to keep it. Clarissa approached again. This time she didn't bother hiding the venom in her voice. I've already warned you twice, she snapped, her hands clenched tight behind her back. The baby's noises are disturbing other passengers. Olivia looked up, her tone gentle but unwavering. He's not crying, he's just adjusting. He's teething. I've done everything I can. A few nearby passengers glanced over, some uncomfortable, others curious. Clarissa's jaw tightened. If you can't keep him quiet, she said louder now, we'll need to relocate you. First class isn't a daycare. That did it. Olivia's breath hitched, and for the first time, she blinked back the sting of tears. Not for herself, but for her son, for being seen as a nuisance simply for existing. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the unexpected happened. The baby shifted in her arms, accidentally knocking over her cup of water, which spilled across her lap, soaking her blouse and her baby's onesie. A gasp escaped her lips, not because of the cold, but because her baby, startled, let out a soft, distressed cry. Immediately, Olivia tried to calm him, bouncing gently, murmuring sweet words. But Clarissa seized the moment. There, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. That's exactly what I warned you about. This is unacceptable. Olivia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She was soaked, holding a crying child, surrounded by strangers, judged, scrutinized, and now attacked. A younger flight attendant stepped forward, concern etched into her features. Miss Drake, maybe we can help her get cleaned up. Maybe. But Clarissa shot her a look that silenced the words in her throat. No, Clarissa said, stepping closer to Olivia, her eyes blazing. She made this choice. She should have known she didn't belong up here. And that's when it happened. In the chaos of the moment, Olivia adjusted her baby again, and her arm accidentally brushed Clarissa's. It was a nothing gesture, barely contact. But Clarissa, so tightly wound, so desperate to assert herself, reacted without thinking. She slapped Olivia. The sound was soft but unmistakable. A sharp, open-palmed strike across Olivia's forearm. Not enough to injure, but more than enough to shock. A gasp rippled through the cabin. A businessman 2 rows back lowered his newspaper. A woman near the aisle stopped mid-sip, her coffee trembling in her hand. For a long, hollow second, no one moved. Olivia didn't cry out. She didn't shout. She looked up, her face pale, and stared directly into Clarissa's eyes. Her baby whimpered softly against her chest, now startled into silence. And Clarissa froze, realizing what she'd done. Olivia didn't say a word. She didn't scream or demand justice. She calmly reached into her soaked diaper bag, pulled out her phone, and sent a single text. Then she looked Clarissa in the eye, calm and steady, and said quietly, "You just made a mistake you can't undo." Clarissa felt her throat tighten. She tried to summon her usual defenses, her smirking authority, but they were gone. The passengers weren't looking away anymore. They weren't pretending. They were watching. Really watching, and their eyes weren't on Olivia, they were on her. A beat passed, then another. Clarissa tried to recover. "I didn't mean, she bumped into me." But no one responded. The passengers had turned from silent bystanders to quiet judges, and Clarissa felt their verdicts hanging in the air like smoke. One of them, a man in 3C, pulled out his phone. Another, a woman in 1A, whispered, "Did she just hit her?" Clarissa's mouth opened again, but this time no sound came. The weight of it all, the slap, the witnesses, the text, was crashing down. And deep in her chest, she felt the first twinge of something she hadn't felt in years. Fear, stay with me, because what happens next, what that text unleashes, shatters the illusion Clarissa built her entire career on. You saw her at her highest. Now you're about to see the beginning of her fall, a fall that no apology, no excuse, no carefully chosen words can stop. And Olivia? She won't have to say a thing. The world will do it for her. If this moment made your heart race, drop a comment to show your support for Olivia. If you've ever been judged unfairly, if you've ever stayed quiet when you deserved better, this story is for you. And believe me, the next part, it's going to leave you speechless. Don't go anywhere. Like and subscribe. Because Clarissa Drake's reckoning has only just begun. The cabin had gone silent, not from the hum of comfort that first class usually offered, but from the weight of something unspoken, something thick and electric hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Vanessa Drake stood frozen in the aisle, her authority unraveling by the second, as the woman she had humiliated, Olivia Carter, sat quietly rocking her now sleeping baby. But the silence wasn't submission. It wasn't weakness. It was something far more dangerous. Because in the moment Vanessa had raised her voice, dismissed a mother's dignity, and slapped away the fragile peace Olivia had tried to preserve, she hadn't just crossed a line. She had trespassed on something sacred. What Vanessa didn't know, what none of the gawking passengers around her knew, was that the text Olivia had sent moments ago wasn't to a friend, or to a support line, or to a lawyer. It was to her husband. And her husband was James Carter, not just any man, but the CEO of the airline, the man who built the very company Vanessa thought she ran from the aisle, the man who in this exact moment had just received a message and no one ever wanted to send his way. "She hit me." The moment that message left Olivia's phone, it stopped being a passenger complaint. It became a matter of corporate reckoning. James was in his office on the top floor of the airline's headquarters when the message arrived. He had been reading reports, sipping coffee, moving through a routine board review. But the moment he saw the text, everything else stopped. His phone dropped onto the desk, and within seconds, a quiet fury lit behind his eyes. Not because his wife was in trouble, but because his wife, who had asked for nothing but peace, had been publicly attacked by someone wearing his logo on her chest. Olivia hadn't called him screaming. She hadn't begged for revenge. She had simply told the truth. And James Carter, a man who had spent a lifetime building his empire on fairness and discipline, didn't need shouting to act. He just needed the truth. Back on the plane, Vanessa tried to pretend the world hadn't shifted. She barked orders, fumbled with her routine, smiled too hard at the remaining passengers. But her eyes kept flicking toward Olivia. Why was she so calm? Why wasn't she yelling, filing a report, making a scene? Why did she look so certain? And then it happened. The in-flight phone rang. It was a sound Vanessa had heard 1,000 times, but this time it didn't land like routine. It landed like a sentence. The captain picked it up, spoke quietly, then glanced up, his expression shifting subtly, like someone realizing they were now standing on a battlefield and had just stepped on the wrong side. He hung up, walked out of the cockpit, and called into the cabin. Vanessa Drake, report to the cockpit immediately. The passengers turned, heads swiveling toward her, some curious, others already knowing. Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. Vanessa's feet felt suddenly too heavy to move, her legs stiff as she walked toward the front of the plane. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that locked door, but in her chest a fear bloomed, a fear that this was no longer about protocol or noise complaints or even that slap. This was about power, real power, and she had just assaulted it. Inside the cockpit, the air was heavy. The captain didn't greet her. Neither did the first officer. Instead, there on the small monitor in the center console was the unmistakable face of James Carter. His expression wasn't angry, it was composed, controlled. The kind of composure that warned of a storm you wouldn't see until it tore the roof off your life. "Miss Drake," he said, calm as ever, "you just laid your hand on my wife." The words hit harder than any shout ever could. Vanessa's knees almost buckled. I I didn't know," she stammered, but James raised a hand. "That's the problem," he said sharply. "You didn't know because you didn't care to check. You assumed, you judged, you humiliated the mother of my children in front of an entire cabin. And now," he exhaled, his voice low, "you're going to understand what it feels like to have your status stripped in front of those same people." Vanessa's voice caught in her throat. "Sir, I can explain." "No," the captain cut in. "You'll explain to HR after you're escorted off this flight." Let that sink in. A woman who had spent her career commanding passengers, lording over seats, enforcing rules like they were commandments, was now about to be walked off the plane like an unruly passenger. Because she thought she was above accountability. Because she never thought the person she was hurting might be connected to power bigger than her own badge. But here's the twist. Olivia never used her husband's name. She never bragged, never threatened, because it wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity. And that is what makes her strength so extraordinary. So if you're watching this, if your heart raced at the moment she stood her ground without a word, if you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or told you didn't belong, drop a comment below to show your support for Olivia. Hit the like button to stand with women who carry quiet power, not because they have to shout, but because their truth is louder than anything else. And don't forget to subscribe because this story, it's far from over. And what's coming next? Justice has wings. And it just took flight. It happened fast. So fast that most passengers didn't realize the shift until it was already happening. 1 second, Vanessa Drake was walking down the aisle with the usual air of confidence that came from years of bossing around passengers and enforcing policies she believed were gospel. And the next, the intercom crackled with a tone no one expected. The captain's voice, usually calm and distant, carried something different this time, a tightness that made heads turn. "Senior flight attendant Vanessa Drake, report to the cockpit, immediately." The words hung in the air like a dropped plate in a quiet room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes rose from newspapers and tablets. Even Olivia Carter, still seated, her baby gently asleep against her chest, lifted her gaze but said nothing. She didn't have to, because everyone in that moment knew the spotlight had shifted. And Vanessa? Her heels clicked, just a little too loud as she made her way forward, stiff, mechanical, like someone walking towards something they couldn't see but instinctively feared. Something had changed, deeply. Behind the cockpit door, the truth unraveled like a pulled thread in Vanessa's perfectly pressed uniform. The captain didn't stand. He didn't offer her a seat. He just looked at her like he no longer recognized her as part of his crew. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low, "I've received a directive from headquarters. This is no longer a routine complaint." She tried to speak, but he held up a hand. "You're not here to explain. You're here to listen." Then he pressed a small button on the comm system, and the cockpit speakers came to life. "This is James Carter." The voice was unmistakable, deep, calm, and powerful. But what made it dangerous wasn't volume. It was precision, each word deliberate. "I've reviewed the situation personally. I've heard reports. I've seen footage. I've read testimony from passengers and staff. And I've heard from my wife, Olivia." Vanessa's mouth went dry. Her knees wobbled. She felt the blood drain from her face. "You put your hands on her," James continued, his tone clipped now, colder. "You humiliated a mother holding her child, and you did it while wearing my airline's uniform. Consider this your final moment in it." The silence that followed was deafening. No yelling, no threats, just consequences. The captain reached over and turned to face her fully. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. You will not speak to passengers. You will not engage with crew. You will take the jump seat until we land. Do you understand?" Vanessa didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She nodded, slow and stunned, as if trying to delay the moment with hesitation. But the captain had already turned back to his instruments. The conversation was over. When she stepped out of the cockpit, the difference was immediate. The passengers weren't pretending anymore. They weren't hiding glances or whispering behind menus. They watched. All of them. Every eye on her as she walked, not down the aisle with authority, but down the aisle as someone who had just been stripped of it. No one needed to know the full story. The way she walked told it all. Shoulders tight, face flushed, hands trembling at her sides. The woman who once gave orders now walked in silence, exposed and undone. And Olivia? She sat still, composed, not smug, not gloating, just calm. A mother who had done nothing but try to travel with her child in peace. And now she was the picture of strength. Vanessa passed her, and in that brief moment, their eyes met. Olivia didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Vanessa looked away first. By the time she reached the jump seat at the back of the plane, the silence had turned into whispers. She could hear them. "That's her. She got removed mid-flight. Must have been serious." And the worst part? No one defended her. Not even the junior crew members she had trained, commanded, even intimidated for years. They passed her without eye contact, without sympathy. And Vanessa realized all at once that she wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't respected. She was forgotten, discarded like a worn-out uniform, no longer useful to the image the airline wanted to uphold. She sat down hard on the metal jump seat, hands gripping her knees, breathing shallow. The flight continued around her, but Vanessa's world had stopped moving. She couldn't process what had just happened. It wasn't supposed to go like this. She was supposed to be the one in control. Always. She had enforced the rules, upheld standards. She had built her reputation on being untouchable. But now, her entire career had crumbled midair, and she hadn't even landed yet. Passengers ordered drinks, crew served meals. The baby cooed in Olivia's arms. Life moved on, but Vanessa stayed frozen, knowing this wasn't just a suspension. This was a stain on her name that would follow her wherever she went. She wanted to scream, to explain, to twist the story into something it wasn't. But deep down, she knew there was no spinning the truth. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. And you, listening right now, you saw it too. You saw the moment power was abused and justice stepped in. You saw a mother humiliated for no reason other than someone else's pride. And you saw that mother respond with quiet strength that changed everything. So if you're still here, if you're feeling the weight of this moment the way Vanessa finally did, comment below to show Olivia she wasn't alone. Drop a "if you believe kindness should never be mistaken for weakness." Say "I stand with Olivia" if you've ever watched someone suffer in silence and wish anyone, would speak up. Because this story, it's not just about one woman's fall. It's about the rise of someone who never asked for power but had it all along. And the world, it finally saw her. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part of Olivia's journey is one you don't want to miss. Justice isn't just landing. It's arriving with purpose. And it's not done yet. By the time the seatbelt sign had turned off and the cabin lights had softened for landing, Vanessa Drake's world had already collapsed. She just hadn't fully realized it yet. But as she sat rigid in the crew jump seat, her back pressed against cold metal, she felt it start to creep in. The fall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Dignity unraveling stitch by stitch, in the silence of 100 watching eyes. No alarms blared, no dramatic outburst marked her downfall. Only the soft hum of the engines, the subtle glances exchanged by passengers, and the faint flickers of smartphone screens catching her face from the corners of her vision. That's when it began, the exposure, the whispers, the judgment, the isolation. One by one, the same passengers she had once dismissed as beneath her began whispering behind their tray tables. Some leaned in, their phones raised just enough to capture a shot of her as she sat, stone-faced and stiff, her polished reputation cracking under the weight of humiliation. She had once ruled the aisles with crisp commands and airtight confidence. Now, she couldn't even meet a stranger's gaze. The flight crew didn't look at her. Mia, the junior attendant she'd mentored, avoided her completely. Others passed her with forced smiles or stiff nods, barely acknowledging her, like she had suddenly become invisible. She had never felt smaller in a place she used to dominate. But the worst part wasn't being ignored. It was the slow, inevitable realization that no one, not the passengers, not the crew, was on her side anymore. She wasn't the respected leader she had always thought herself to be. She wasn't feared. She wasn't even tolerated. She was an embarrassment, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time at 30,000 feet. She could hear bits of conversations, just out of reach but not far enough to miss entirely. That's her. Did you see what she did? They said she grabbed the woman's arm. She slapped her hand with a baby in it. Unbelievable. Her ears burned as if every word were a match being struck beside her. She stared at the metal panel in front of her, willing it to swallow her whole. For years, she had believed she was above consequences, that enforcing the rules made her immune to them. But now, sitting in silence, she could feel every decision she'd made circling back like ghosts, louder than ever. When the captain's voice came through the intercom, it wasn't his usual warm, scripted announcement. It was flat, emotionless. We are beginning our descent. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. No one clapped. No one smiled. The cabin had shifted into a place of discomfort. Passengers were whispering, recording, judging, and she could do nothing to stop it. And yet, even in the middle of this unraveling, Vanessa still clung to the last thing she had, the hope that she could control the narrative, that she could twist this into a misunderstanding, a misstep, a moment of stress. When the plane touched down, she waited until most passengers had gathered their things before she stood. Then, without warning, she walked down the aisle. She passed the row where Olivia Carter still sat, her baby peacefully sleeping in her arms, her gaze steady out the window. Olivia hadn't moved, hadn't made a scene, hadn't said a word since the confrontation, and yet she had been the catalyst for everything. Vanessa hesitated beside her, the hum of passengers behind her now buzzing louder with anticipation. Phones raised slightly, whispers stopped. Everyone was watching. She cleared her throat. Olivia, she began, her voice small, a shadow of the commanding tone she'd once used to silence an entire cabin. Olivia turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met Vanessa's with an unnerving calm. There was no anger in them, no hatred, just clarity. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Vanessa continued, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't mean to offend you or cause a scene. I misjudged the situation. Olivia's eyes didn't leave hers. She said nothing. I didn't know who you were, Vanessa added quickly, trying to fill the silence. If I had known, Olivia blinked once. That was all it took. So, if I were just any other woman, your actions would have been okay. The words weren't sharp. They weren't loud. But they cut deeper than any shout could have. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. Her voice caught in her throat. She could feel the heat rising up her neck. Olivia tilted her head, her voice low and steady. You didn't just question my seat. You questioned my right to exist in a space I paid for. You saw me with a baby and assumed I didn't belong. You looked at me and decided I wasn't enough. More passengers had stopped moving now, listening, witnessing. You want to apologize, Olivia said softly. But the apology isn't for me. It's for you, to make you feel better, to try to clean up the mess after the world saw you for who you really are. Vanessa's breath hitched. Her hands trembled at her sides. You're not sorry you did it, Olivia added, eyes locking with hers. You're sorry someone powerful was watching. And just like that, Olivia turned away. Not out of disrespect, but because she was done. Vanessa had nothing left to say. And if you're still listening, if your chest is tight, if your heart is racing, if you've ever been judged, underestimated, or treated like less because of how you looked or what you carried or where you sat, then comment below. Say, I see Olivia. Say, I believe in quiet strength. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't fight back. It's let the truth speak for itself. And today, Olivia didn't just speak. She let the world see, and now the world can decide. So tell us, do you think Vanessa's apology came too late? Comment your thoughts below. Like this video to support Olivia's dignity, and subscribe for more true justice because the next chapter, it's only just beginning. The plane touched down with a soft rumble, but for Vanessa Drake, the landing felt like an earthquake. Her heart pounded louder than the roar of the engines, and every second after the tires hit the tarmac stretched into eternity. She sat stiffly in the crew jump seat at the rear of the plane, hands clenched in her lap, uniform still crisp, but now soaked in the sweat of fear, regret, and realization. This was the end, not just the end of the flight, the end of everything. Her career, her identity, her illusion of control. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers unbuckled their seatbelts with casual ease, already reaching for their bags, chatting about dinner plans or layovers. But no one was talking to Vanessa. No one was asking for help or thanking her for the flight. Instead, heads turned, phones came out, and the whispers began again. She could feel them, those eyes, the judgment, the disbelief. The quiet satisfaction from some who had seen how she'd treated Olivia Carter and now watched karma unfold in real time. Her palms were damp, her chest tight, and when the intercom chimed with the final announcement, cabin crew, disarm doors, and cross-check, her breath caught in her throat. Then the captain's voice echoed through the cabin once more, and it was unmistakably deliberate. Miss Vanessa Drake, please gather your belongings and prepare to disembark first. Security will be meeting you at the door. Gasps rippled through the rows. Passengers who had stayed quiet earlier now shifted in their seats, eyes wide. The murmurs grew louder. Some weren't even trying to hide their phones anymore. Vanessa stood, but it wasn't like before. There was no poise in her posture, no quiet power in her step. Her legs felt like stone, every movement mechanical, as if her body was acting without her consent. She moved down the aisle, each step heavier than the last. First-class passengers leaned slightly, watching. Some whispered, some filmed. One man muttered under his breath, "Finally." She didn't respond, couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her mind too loud. Each row she passed was a reminder. This is what you did. This is what they see now. And then, as she passed seat 2A, her eyes flicked to the woman who had unraveled everything. Olivia Carter sat silently, her baby still asleep in her arms, her expression calm, almost peaceful. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just watched Vanessa for a moment, then looked away like she had already moved on. That cut deeper than rage, because Vanessa had expected fury, maybe even some final remark to twist the knife. But Olivia gave her none, because she didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and everyone knew who had caused it. When Vanessa reached the plane door, her knees nearly buckled. There, just beyond the glass, stood 2 uniformed security officers and 3 airline executives, one of whom she recognized immediately. Marcus Denton, Regional Director of Crew Operations. She had spoken to him at company galas. She had smiled beside him in corporate photos. But now he didn't greet her. He didn't nod. He didn't even blink. He stood with his arms crossed, expression stony, as the aircraft door opened and cold airport air rushed in. The silence that followed was chilling. No one moved. No one spoke. The passengers watched, some wide-eyed, others stone-faced, recording every second. A woman in row 4 whispered, "She's really getting escorted off." And the man beside her replied, "Good, about time." Vanessa stepped forward, her steps echoing on the jet bridge floor like a final drumbeat. The security officers flanked her without touching her, but they didn't need to. The message was clear. You are not one of us anymore. She glanced back once, just once, and what she saw made her stomach twist. Passengers were still filming. One was even live streaming. And Mia, the junior flight attendant she'd once dismissed as too soft, too timid, stood just inside the cabin door. Their eyes met, but there was no hatred in Mia's gaze, just disappointment. Vanessa tore her eyes away and stepped into the terminal, where more airline staff stood waiting. And then, flash, a camera. Someone had taken a photo, then another, phones raised, screens glowed. She tried to shield her face, but it was useless. The internet didn't care about apologies. It cared about stories. And Vanessa had just become one. Marcus finally spoke. His voice was low, but carried the weight of a gavel. Miss Drake, your termination is being processed. HR will contact you for final procedures. Effective immediately, your credentials have been revoked. You are not permitted in any staff areas or airline-operated zones going forward. Vanessa's lips parted as if to speak, but she couldn't find her voice. The humiliation was so complete, so public, it felt physical, like her skin was being peeled away in front of everyone. If you're still listening, if your chest is tight, your stomach turning, your heart heavy, it should be. Because this wasn't just a firing. This was a reckoning. For every passenger who's been talked down to. For every mother made to feel like an inconvenience. For every person who's been treated like they didn't belong in a space they earned. This was for them. And Vanessa? She had built her career believing she was above consequences, that her uniform made her untouchable. But today, her badge didn't protect her. Her experience didn't save her. Her power didn't shield her. Because when you use your authority to hurt people, eventually that same authority turns against you. So if you believe in accountability, if you believe that respect should never be conditional, if you've ever been treated unfairly and wish someone would finally be held responsible, comment below. Say justice was served. Leave A if you felt the weight of Olivia's silence. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because stories like these, they matter. They remind us that no matter how high someone climbs, one wrong step can bring it all crashing down. And sometimes, that fall is exactly what's needed to lift someone else up. Vanessa Drake had always believed airports were places of arrival, of purpose, of movement, of control. But today, walking through the cold glass doors of the crew office for the last time, she realized they could also be places of endings. Not the kind you prepare for, not even the kind that gives you a chance to catch your breath. No, this was an end that swallowed you whole before you realized you'd taken your final step. The ride from the gate to the administrative offices had been silent. The same airport she once walked with pride now felt like a stranger's domain. Her badge no longer scanned at any door. Her employee profile, vanessadrake.crew@Skystar Air, had already been deactivated. When she pulled out her phone to check one last message, it flashed red. Access denied. This account is no longer valid. A knot formed in her stomach. Not just because she'd been fired, but because she'd been erased. The crew office, once a second home, felt sterile and alien now. The receptionist, who usually greeted her by name, didn't even meet her eyes. Behind the desk stood a woman from HR, a representative Vanessa didn't recognize, which made the whole thing worse. Her presence said it all. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a process, a script. Vanessa, the woman said calmly, we'll need your badge, your tablet, your uniform items, and your ID. There was no warmth, no hesitation, just procedure. Vanessa nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she unclipped her name tag. Her hands paused over the badge. That simple piece of plastic had once opened every door she'd ever needed. Now it felt like a funeral token. She laid it gently on the counter like it would shatter if she let go too fast. You can change in the locker room, the HR woman added. Your belongings will be boxed and mailed to the address on file. Vanessa didn't respond. She moved toward the locker room like a ghost drifting through a life that no longer belonged to her. Inside, the silence was crushing. The scent of dry soap and deodorant, the hum of the fluorescent lights, it was all too normal for what she was going through. She changed slowly, folding her uniform with care like she was still one of them. Her hands lingered on the crisp blue jacket, smoothing it as if doing so would make the last 12 years reappear. But they didn't. They were gone, just like her career. She stepped out, clothes folded in a neat pile, and placed them on the counter. The HR woman gave a short nod and slid a document across to her. Vanessa scanned the top line. Final termination and non-rehire status. Her name was stamped in bold at the top. Her hands shook as she read the second clause. Permanent industry blacklist. Not eligible for rehire by any commercial airline under the Skystar Aviation Network. She blinked. Industry blacklist? She whispered. The HR woman didn't look up. Standard protocol in cases of passenger misconduct and public liability. The words hit harder than she expected. Not just fired, not just cut off. Flagged, branded, permanently banned from the only world she had ever known. Can I appeal? She asked, her voice hoarse. The HR woman paused, then looked up slowly. Her tone didn't change. Appeals are not available in disciplinary cases tied to executive-level directives. Vanessa felt the blood drain from her face. That was it. James Carter's order. Final. No path to redemption. She signed the form with a trembling hand. No one offered her a pen. She had to use her own, still clipped to her coat. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once signed on boarding papers, training rosters, mentor logs, all with that same pen. And now she'd used it to end herself. When she turned to leave, the woman behind the desk gave one last instruction. You'll be escorted out the side exit to avoid press or unwanted attention. Attention, like she was a scandal now. Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't protest. What was the point? The walk to the exit felt endless. Her footsteps echoed against the tile like they were marking time, each one another second falling away from the life she once had. And as the door opened to the back loading zone, she looked back one last time. No goodbye. No one called out her name. No one even watched her go. Outside, the wind hit her hard. She wasn't even allowed to exit through the front terminal. Too much risk that someone would film her. Too many people already had. Online, the videos had exploded. She hadn't dared to check her social media, but the app notifications kept flooding in. Mentions, hashtags, posts titled, "The Flight Attendant Who Snapped." Caught on camera, Skystar crew disgraces first-class passenger. She thought no one was watching. One particularly cruel comment stuck in her mind. She looked so powerful until she realized power doesn't belong to people like her. Vanessa stood at the curb with nothing but her purse, a crumpled HR packet, and a single duffel bag. No security anymore, no driver, just the sting of the wind and a view of the arrivals curb where families hugged and business travelers scrolled through emails. She watched a new flight crew walk by, young, confident, joking with each other in the same uniform she used to wear. None of them even glanced her way. Her presence was invisible now, her past a whisper. She wasn't Vanessa Drake, senior flight attendant anymore. She was just a woman who used to be someone. She opened her phone again. She didn't know why. Maybe she hoped for a text from someone, anyone, but all she saw was one final email. Industry notification. Employee Vanessa Drake has been removed under cause code 47. Do not consider for rehire. Revoke access immediately. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sat down hard on the cold bench outside the employee exit. For the first time in hours, she let the tears come, not the quiet, restrained kind she was trained to hold back. These were full, gut-wrenching sobs that cracked open something she didn't know she had been keeping buried. People passed her. Some stared. Some walked faster. Some whispered. But no one stopped. And maybe that was the hardest part of all. Not the blacklisting, not the shame, not even the videos, but the realization that she could disappear, just like that, and the world would keep moving. Flights would keep taking off, crews would keep rotating, Olivia would go home with her baby. James Carter would go back to his empire, and Vanessa would be left here, sitting on a cold bench outside a world that no longer needed her. So if you're still listening, if you've ever felt the sting of being cast out, of realizing you're no longer welcome in the only space you've ever called home, drop A in the comments. Say, I see you, Vanessa. not to justify her actions, not to excuse her mistakes, but to acknowledge that even those who fall the hardest are still human. And sometimes all we really want is to not vanish unnoticed. Don't forget to like if you felt her regret. Subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain and reveal the cost of pride. Because Vanessa Drake thought she had power. But sometimes real power is knowing when you've lost it. The internet is a strange, ruthless place. One second, Vanessa Drake was a respected flight attendant, walking the aisle with poise and practiced authority. And the next, her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. It started with one blurry photo, her walking down the aisle, flanked by security, her expression unreadable. Someone in first class had snapped it as she passed, then uploaded it with the caption, "She thought she was above the rules until the CEO's wife boarded her flight." Within minutes, it spread like wildfire. Comments, shares, reposts, re-edits. By the time Vanessa had left the airport grounds, the story wasn't just a story, it was the story. She opened her phone, hands trembling, only to be met with a flood of notifications. Her name was everywhere. Reddit threads, Twitter chapter X hashtags, airline employee forums, passengers posting TikToks detailing everything they had seen. She slapped a mother holding a baby. The woman said nothing, just sent a text. Turns out the baby's father owns the airline. Some videos showed clips from inside the plane. Voices low, the tension thick. Vanessa's sharp tone unmistakable as she tried to control the narrative. But no video captured her side. No one waited to hear her explain. And maybe she couldn't have explained even if they had. Recruitment agencies, once eager to work with her, began to distance themselves without a word. She checked her email that night, hoping, praying for at least one response of support. Instead, she found rejection after rejection. Given the current public attention surrounding your name, we are unable to proceed. We must respectfully withdraw our offer to collaborate. Your professional reputation has been compromised beyond our capacity to mitigate. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she read each line, a growing sense of helplessness twisting in her chest. It didn't feel real. Just days ago, she had been reviewing crew assignments for the next month. Now, she wasn't just unemployed, she was unwanted. The world wasn't watching her fall with empathy, it was watching her fall with popcorn. She scrolled through a comment thread on an airline forum, the pit in her stomach deepening with every post. She got what she deserved. That level of arrogance? Unreal. Imagine thinking you're above passengers. She forgot she was just a glorified waitress in the ski. Flew with her once. Coldest crew member I ever met. Not surprised. Her vision blurred with tears. These were strangers, people who had never met her. Yet they tore into her like they knew everything. Her personality, her intentions, her past. They didn't see the late nights she worked, the flights she stayed on after her shift to help struggling passengers, the grief she carried in silence after her mother passed, smiling through safety announcements while her heart broke. They didn't see any of it. All they saw was a villain, and the internet loves a villain. Vanessa curled up on the edge of her couch, the apartment dark save for the glow of her phone screen. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Her friends, what few she had left, had gone quiet. Some removed her from group chats. Others unfollowed her without a word. No one wanted to be associated with her now. Even her LinkedIn profile was being bombarded with hateful messages. Hope you never work again. You're everything wrong with customer service. Glad your fall is public. Makes the rest of us feel seen. Vanessa dropped the phone, her body shaking. How had her life unraveled this fast? It wasn't just career death, it was character assassination. And the worst part, no one came to her defense. Not a single colleague, not a former passenger, not even the junior attendants she had mentored over the years. The silence was deafening. Maybe they agreed with the world. Maybe they had just been waiting for the fall. And maybe she had given them a reason. The thought haunted her. Had she truly become so cold, so dismissive, so blind to the people around her? Had she been so obsessed with control that she forgot compassion? Her breath hitched. For a moment, she wanted to throw her phone, to delete everything, to run. But she didn't. She opened the app again, searched her name. A new post had gone up just minutes ago, a video compilation. Her being escorted off the plane, passengers whispering, a voiceover saying, "She walked like a queen." But even queens fall. The comments were brutal, and yet one stood out, a small one hidden deep in the replies. "I flew with her once. She was cold, yes, but I remember seeing her help an elderly woman who had spilled coffee all over her lap. She didn't roll her eyes or sigh. She cleaned it up. She even walked the woman to her Uber after the flight. People aren't black and white. We're all messy. She just got caught at her worst moment." Vanessa stared at that comment for a long time. A tiny flicker of something almost like hope flared in her chest. One voice, one person who remembered her not as a monster, but as human. And maybe that's what she needed to believe right now, that she was still worth something, that she wasn't completely irredeemable, that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't have to end here. So if you're watching this, if you've made it this far, comment below. Let her know she's still seen. Drop a kind word, or just say, "I hear you, Vanessa." Because even if you believe she made a mistake, even if you think she deserved consequences, she's still a person beneath it all. A person who lost everything in a single day. A person trying to make sense of the wreckage. And sometimes, we all fall. But how we rise again? That's a story worth telling. Show her you're still listening, like this video if you believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real, and emotional stories just like this. Because Vanessa Drake didn't just lose her job, she lost her voice. Let's give it back, one word at a time. Vanessa Drake sat alone on the edge of her small balcony, the wind gently tugging at her hair, the sun slowly dipping beyond the skyline. It had been 8 months since the flight that shattered her world. 8 months since the day she walked down the aisle of an aircraft, not as a commanding flight attendant, but as a cautionary tale. She had spent those first weeks in silence, drowning in shame, replaying every mistake like a broken record. The humiliation, the backlash, the way her name spread like wildfire across news sites and social media, it had all burned her down to the core. And for a long time, she thought she'd never rise again. But something changed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, like healing always is. One day she saw a comment under a reposted video of her infamous flight. "I hope she's learning something from this. I'd love to see her come back. Not perfect, but better." That one message cracked something open. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't praise. It was hope. And in that moment, Vanessa realized something she had never fully understood. Not in all her years of training, enforcing policies, or commanding the cabin. Real power isn't about control. It's about humility. It's about respect. And more than anything, it's about growth. She started from nothing. Literally, no job, no reputation, just a name too scorched to speak aloud. But she didn't run from it. She owned it. And she reached out to the very people she had once overlooked. Former colleagues, passengers who had quietly endured her indifference, even flight attendants who had been intimidated by her presence. She apologized. Not with excuses, not with explanations, just raw, honest regret. Some forgave her, others didn't. But each conversation carved away the arrogance that had once ruled her. She volunteered at a travel center for displaced passengers, helping families rebook flights, assisting the elderly who had lost their bags, comforting children separated from parents in the chaos of travel. And it was there, in the crowded, noisy, deeply human mess of that center, that Vanessa finally saw herself again. Not as the woman in the polished uniform, but as a person who could care, who could listen, who could start over. Then one day something happened that she never expected. She received an email. It wasn't from a major airline or a recruiter offering a second chance. It was from a small regional aviation school. The subject line simply read, "We saw your story. Want to talk?" Vanessa hesitated at first, unsure if this was another trap, another public shaming in disguise. But curiosity got the better of her. She replied. Days later, she sat in a modest office with a program director who didn't flinch when he mentioned the incident. Instead, he leaned forward and asked, "What would you teach a new flight attendant about that day?" And for the first time in her life, Vanessa answered from the heart. She didn't deflect. She didn't protect herself. She told the truth. about the power she abused, the assumptions she made, and the pain she had caused. And at the end of that meeting, the director extended his hand and said, "That's exactly why we want you here." Now Vanessa teaches aviation ethics and human empathy at that very school. Her lectures don't sugarcoat what she did. In fact, her story is part of the curriculum. New students watch the video, they read the headlines, then they hear from her. Not the version of Vanessa that strutted through first class, but the one who lost everything and chose not to stay lost. She talks about bias, about silence, about the invisible ways we judge others and the visible ways those judgments wound. She tells her students that uniform doesn't make you better. It just gives you a choice to lift people up or push them down. And every time she stands in front of that classroom, every time a student comes up after class with tears in their eyes and says, "I see things differently now," Vanessa knows this is where she was always meant to be. Not in the sky enforcing rules, but on the ground shaping the hearts of those who will rise above it. So to anyone watching this, anyone who followed Vanessa's story from the scandal to the silence, let this be a reminder. People can change. Mistakes can be lessons. And even the hardest fall can lead to the most honest kind of flight. Maybe you've been like Vanessa, so focused on control that you forgot compassion. Or maybe you've been like Olivia, the one who was judged, dismissed, underestimated. Either way, we all have something to learn from this. About dignity, about kindness, about using our voices not to hurt, but to heal. If Vanessa's journey moved you, if her growth inspired something in you, leave a comment below. Let her know that you see her not for the person she was, but for who she's becoming. Your words might be the light someone else needs. Like this video if you believe people deserve a second chance when they've done the work, faced the truth, and chosen growth. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this. Real, raw, redemptive stories that prove life doesn't end when you fall. Sometimes it begins right there, because Vanessa Drake thought she had reached her final chapter. But it was only the beginning of her rewrite. And if she can find her way back, you can too.